Özlem, thank you. I thought I was already known to you. I'm sorry. But instead of doing that and also giving you more screen fatigue, I think I give you something for some convivial listening. So let's share some sound here. How do I do that? I hope you can hear this.
Please wait. Don't take Istanbul card. Created successfully.
This podcast has been made possible with the support of a Marie Curie Fellowship from the European Commission. Welcome to Exiled Lives.
Yeah, I think that'll do it for now. And here should be the PowerPoint. So thank you, Özlem. Thank you, Özgür, for giving me the opportunity to speak a little bit about my Marie Curie-project, Exiled Lives. I'm actually a researcher at the Freie Universität in Berlin, but also an assistant professor in arts, culture, and media in Groningen. And related to this project, I mean, the project is, let's say, is focusing on artists from Turkey who have fled or left, in some cases also, Turkey recently and came to Germany, but also Netherlands and the UK, mostly due to the growing restrictive and punitive public sphere that started with the two-year period of the state of emergency in 2016, but that was actually already longer in motion since the Gezi uprising in 2013, which actually this week we have the 8th anniversary of. So maybe people can talk about that and relate to that as well here. Since I'm also quite involved in this exile of, or let's say this silent exodus, as I call it, of people who left Turkey. Since I arrived in Berlin, I also felt the need to start collecting the voices and the works of Kurdish and Turkish artists in response to the urgent cultural, political, and aesthetic debates in both Turkey and Europe, actually. But concomitant to that, and that has to do also a little bit with the pandemic, I started to do a lot of interviews on Zoom. And then I realized that it actually was a wonderful opportunity to start a podcast. So what you just have listened to is the opening of the podcast, which I launched actually yesterday. And I see this also as a kind of official launch. There's one episode available now on Exilic City Art and Resilience with the voices of Seçil Honeywell and Işıl Erika Vuk. And Işıl is also here, so we will hear her voice today as a kind of trailer maybe, but she will be speaking more, I guess, about her own works tomorrow in the 6th panel, I believe. Now, related to this, I started to think more profoundly lately on affect and ethics of care. Besides writing about these issues, I'm actually also, and this is maybe interesting for Caitlin, I'm also in my previous, let's say, research, an expert in sound and listening in the theater. So I'm also trying to relate now all of these ideas to the making of this podcast, and it is actually my colleague Dylan Robinson. Oh no, I'll actually have to. No, that's okay. It's my colleague Dylan Robinson who brought to my attention the idea of longing for a sovereign space in writing, in thinking, in reading, but also in making the podcast, to speak differently, or in the words of Suzanne Kuzik, quote, to try to speak both truly and helpfully, despite fears of what we might be able to say or convey, whilst attempting to do so. And I believe this is also very similar to what artists are trying to do. In a way, they're also trying to find for this kind of space beyond borders and frames that restrict them, and that also affects, of course, their living situations and the making of art and the conditions for that. I relate that in my paper today to the idea of the frame. Of course, we know maybe all Erving Goffman on this matter, who relates it to or sees it as essential to the presentation of self in daily life. And the frame is actually, I see it as a kind of triple thing, as an inevitability, as an imperative, and also as a restraining boundary in our structures of perception. But also, I think, in how we organize care for each other and in the art worlds, if there is such a thing. Artists in exile often report the problem of the demand to make art about their migration and exile, as well as the bureaucracy that comes along with it, which wounds the subjectivity of the artist a second time all over again after the rupture and loss of the home country, the peer group that confirms their status and identity as an artist, and the comfort of the language and the culture around them that also lends value to their works. So I was very glad to see the call for this workshop, and I want to take this notion of the exilic and migratory healing further as a mode of resilience against restraining cultural politics of care, and you could also include solidarity in that, as when it becomes a framing of the already framed to fit acceptable societal norms of support and engagement. I see actually the artist as, in the first place, the people who play the resilient role themselves, which made them vulnerable in the first place. And it's especially the case with the Kurdish artists, but that's also the case with the people around the now wrongly imprisoned philanthropist Osman Kavala in Turkey. But I also want to reflect through this idea of migratory healing, my own positionality. I actually do not naively want to pretend to believe that even my writings or the podcast will heal anybody. But I believe that a profound engagement with an ethics of care in the research that can also result in aesthetic experiences and in dialogue, and hopefully convivial listening as well, should mean a step at least in the good direction. Now, I take this term ethics of care from feminist ethics, Carol Gilligan, for instance, who was already mentioned, and Nell Noddings, which in its earliest form sought to challenge conceptions of ethics based on justice and rights with an ethics based on the values central to the way humans care for each other. Now, I have to immediately say that I do not believe that justice and care are antithetical to each other, as much as I also don't believe in essentializing the divides. In these earlier discussions, there was this divide between the public as a masculine space, as a masculine world, against ethics associated with mothering and then thereby femininity. So I totally don't subscribe to such essentialism. But what I do take from these debates is that ethics of care, quote, challenges the vision of the autonomous actor as the sole source of ethics, as it draws on our reciprocal relations with others or reliance on others as a source of ethical inquiry. And I think this is very important. When thinking of such an ethics of care within the space of art, we might start thinking also of an aesthetics of care. And Thompson, that's from that book, which you see there, I can't see it myself, the Performing Care book, proposes to include attentiveness at the heart of the creative process, as well as the outcome of it. Quote, an aesthetics of care is therefore a sensory ethical practice that involves not only learning how to be attentive and patient, how to listen and respond, but also how to rethink our own attitudes about difference and exclusion. Now, and this might be also interesting for Caitlin, I bring in this book from my colleague Dylan Robinson, which just came out, Hungry Listening, because I think this idea of rethinking our own attitudes means also that we should be very attentive as researchers, but also as art consumers, for our own colonialist tendencies, habits, and impulses, and especially also in listening. So it requires, as Dylan would say, a decolonization of perception. Quote, they may require new frames of listening that do not treat listening as a single sense activity while resisting the hunger to consume alterity. It means shifting the places, models, and structures of how we listen. End of quote. Reflecting on what this could actually mean for framing, which is actually, as I just said, is an inevitability, and it's a natural response in our perceptive and cognitive systems. This conceptual decolonization does not mean, or sorry, this perceptual decolonization does not mean to completely destroy all signifying and symbolic frames created by our minds and cultural knowledge, but to be highly attentive and aware of such frames in our listening responses towards alterity that actually establish and reproduce these internalized asymmetrical and non-reciprocal forms of engagement with each other and even with oneself. Now, I would like to illustrate some of these ideas further with some observations I made in the research and also in making the podcast. And first one, actually for that, I think it's significant to listen again to a snippet of my podcast where Cecile speaks. And for that, I need to quickly find, sorry about that, the right moment. So that's around here. Let's listen. Can you, yeah.
I have no problem carrying that luggage with me, you know.
Actually, the question I have to say, I'm sorry, that I asked was if she finds also this desire for creativity as a burden that is kind of given to her as an artist from outside.
Coming from where I'm coming from, I have no problem. Of course, I'm going to use this platform to be the voice of the people who cannot raise their voice. Of course, bring attention to the certain issues where people cannot do it back home. I have no problem doing that, but I'm against to turn into a machine where I constantly produce this kind of material here so that some of the people feel better about themselves or better about their country. This is something I want to make clear. And what I'm trying to do with Right Now Berlin is just the whole thing is about not to get used to what has been forced to us, basically.
So I guess the PowerPoint is still on, right? Can you see it still? I have to click it. Okay, where are we? I lost my slide, apparently. There we are. So I recognize in Cecile's answer the same argument that is quite ubiquitous in theater and cultural studies, which I also found in Jana Meerson's book, Performing Exile, Performing Self, namely how the destabilization, or you could say even the trauma, caused by the exilic living situation demands to be worked through in creative ways, the exilic performative, as she calls it, that produces a kind of new artist identity by performing the act of self-fashioning, whilst taking the burden to represent the voice of others who are by default voiceless. Cecile seems to be very cautious of that burden when it becomes a machine work, she says. But it is really the work of writing together. And she mentions her project Right Now, Berlin, which is a playwriting community. And it's very similar to what she did earlier at the Arcola in London with community theatre, in which she sees a kind of urgent responsiveness in the growing lethargy, political apathy, and a getting used to right-wing populism and its rhetorics. So those same impulses exist in the very call for creativity from migrant artists seen as only native experience experts of their country, as if what they express is separate from our world and political systems, which is of course clearly not. And you know what she says? Here you see her. And you know what, Peter, if it doesn't work, at least, it's self-therapy that we don't go mad. Yeah, and here you see also a picture of her community theater piece, Say Your Name, Adena Söyle, which was based on the Gezi uprising, and to make some kind of awareness around that in London. Now, I quickly moved to Işıl, but she might be speaking more about this as well herself. Let's have a listen there, if I may. I can just quickly go to her recording, and then we have to go to around here.
To me, to reflect on the way I was making art, and it was so much when I was in Turkey. Of course, the environment around me was really loaded, and that reflected on my work. It was really social, political issues. And then here, beginning again, noticing around me, or not knowing anything, to start again from zero. I think I slowed down, and I took my time again to really, and it's a luxury as well. I can accept it, you know, to be able to take your time. And that's definitely an advantage also. I must, to recognize it. I must recognize it. And taking the time, I feel, in a way, my art, or the way I make art, or the way I look at art, it became so much about connecting with one another. Maybe not so much about the bigger issues, but how to connect one another through a feeling. And in a way, the performance that I spoke about, Dear Fear, reflects that. It was talking so much about, racism and discrimination, and being the outsider. But the way I related to it, or the way I could talk about it, was through this feeling of fear. And that's something I think everybody could connect in a way.
Right. So she speaks of slow time, or taking the time as a privilege in her own situation, which she also wants to, I think, make people experience through the effects of her work. And the main effect that she found to communicate here was fear, an existential fear for the other, but also the fear of being the other. This primordial effect is so much shaped by memory, as well as personal experience, as exile is foremost also an affective state. In the slowness, and we talked about this impasse already, actually, I also recognize the repeated postponement of a previously imagined future, the permanent temporariness that exile reinforces as the exiled live through a continuous indeterminate future in the present. So her work, Dear Fear, as a kind of contemporary fairy tale, then addresses that state of mind, as well as the social and cultural boundaries in the gaze of others, epitomized by the sentence, and that's actually her other work, You Don't Look Turkish, but it's related. This kind of sentence is kind of very loaded in this context. And that keeps people in that effective state of postponement of life in its place. Işıl made also photography, and that's this piece, You Don't Look Turkish, around this question. You can see here, and I like the idea that the water reflects also on the banner that she holds up here. She's really trying to challenge, as she says herself, with this, also sending it back to the person who questions, and make them aware of the frames and stereotypes that are associated with the sense of asking for someone's place of origin and nationality. And then the last one, if I may, I know I'm actually a little bit over time, but that's not related to the podcast, but that's a little bit about the research about theater. And this is something that just came up last week in a wonderful conference that Hakan Altan has organized, who is also around here. So welcome, good to see you here. And that's about the same slowness that I found in the performance. I will say it in German, maybe Zwischenhalt, or in Turkish Aradurak, Ravastke Haraf in Kurmanca, or Stopover. This is a piece by the exiled artist, the Kurdish artist Mirza Metin, which he produced for Shemola Performance and the Bonds Fringe Ensemble in Germany, whilst being in residence there. Now, in this performance, and there we have him, actually 3 actors, 3 passengers, let's say, one Turkish, one Kurdish, and one German, all speaking their own respective languages, find themselves waiting for a bus that never comes. While in the background there is this, there's a looming storm, and this is this very, very Beckettian situation, I would say. The repeated reference to the storm creates the impression that it must be something else, a metaphor, like a mythological sign for something else. And right at the beginning of the play, the Turkish man speaks of an urge to simply go away as the best option, to find a job, to stay low until the storm calms down, and perhaps return, or maybe not. Now, in this storm metaphor, I immediately recognized effectively the storm that I and my partner also, who is a Turkish peace academic, left behind. But for Mirza, it clearly meant even something bigger than that. So when I asked about this metaphor in this conference, Mirza reflected on the storm as something that many people in civilizations share. And it became clear that the storm, which Kurds in Turkey and elsewhere have lived through as oppression from colonialism, as he calls it, is not a struggle for individual autonomy, going back to this question of ethical inquiry and the autonomous subject, but it's a collective force that connects all the historical oppressed and wretched of the earth. And this is something that Mirza came to realize while being intellectually stimulated by being in Germany. This universal message works through the diegesis of the play in an empty black box theater on a most effective plane. What we could ask, though, is if this crisis of the storm is really antithetical to the resolution that the 3 characters in their constant linguistic confusion seem to be unsuccessfully actually waiting for. And that's the last quote that I want to bring in, and that's, I think, an interesting idea that we can discuss further from Matthias Warstadt, where he actually says that modern theater visionaries in the 20th century have described and recognized exactly this, namely that the crisis is not finished or coped with through the healing, but that the crisis is the healing. So with that open thought, I want to open the discussion. I actually prepared some questions, but I'm also very open to hear your own. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peter. We are a bit running ahead of time, out of time, but yes, the floor is yours, the audience, for your questions and comments. Right. Yes, Caitlin has a question, please.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Yeah, I was interested in this idea of listening as a sort of multi-sensory encounter and practice, and I was wondering if you could have any ideas about techniques and methods to center the listening body, as well as a more conventional oral perceptions. So yeah, if you have any ideas about the practice approach to inviting and incorporating the listening sensory body, but at the same time, I was wondering if you're aware of any analytical frames or theories that foregrounds the sensory and sensual listening body. So kind of 2 parts on that point there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I am not really practicing these methods within the research as yet. I mean, it might be interesting to do so. I mean, in the second part of my research, I will be doing workshops. But I do teach sound and listening at university. And there, what I have actually been developing in Turkey, out of necessity in a way as well, was the combination of all of these techniques that you also spoke of from Paulina Oliveros and others, which is basically making people more aware of modes of listening, and connect that with Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, because as you maybe everybody knows about that kind of theory, there are these 3 pillars: the image, the text, and the sound. But the sound is the least developed in Boal's thinking. So I try to find kind of my own way, and using some of these exercises, which of course also relates to making sound with your own body and using your voice, to make people more aware of how it actually triggers different modes of of listening, and that are actually in a way, restrictive. These are impulses. They work on an affective level. But if you give at least students, in my case, these are students, the chance to experiment with them, they get more aware about them. But I haven't yet connected this to the research. I have to say that in a way it was a little bit disillusioning making the podcast, because you have to think of so many other aesthetic aspects, which has to do with creating a kind of genuine experience of the conversation in an aesthetically appealing way. I don't know if other artists here can also comment on that, but it's a very tedious work of finding the right sound qualities, rather than really caring for the interviewees. But I hope it's a learning curve. It's my first episode, and I'm currently making more that I will learn through it.
Aslı is a question.
I'm sorry, I really don't want to take too much time. I'll be very short and quick. Hopefully the answer will also be short. I was, of course, very much interested in your work and the presentation, Peter. On the podcasting, I will ask actually a contrasting question to what you just said in response to Caitlin's question, because I think it's for the artists and for the performing artists, I find it that the podcast is free talk, finally, in the sense that, their life is full of performance, and performance, in my mind, as a viewer, is deep talk in your mind the whole time. And so you just need a release from that. And when you're interviewing these performing artists, I would just let them talk, basically, and then work on the techniques of how, the podcast is going to be feasible and well listened and aesthetically pleasing. Yeah. But, on the side of the performer, I would just want them to freely talk.
Yeah, that is definitely the idea. And I can already tell that I learned my lesson in the first one, where I gave them a quote to reflect on, and then the quote kind of blew up, and then I had to cut it out, because I really also don't want to hear constantly my own voice. So I was trying to really reduce my own input and really maximize their input. Talking about what you were saying, it's actually very relevant in terms of how free they feel. I do believe in some sense I have mastered now some kind of way of making people very comfortable. So at least maybe Özgür can also speak of the experience of that they, it felt like a free conversation, and it's very different from when I do the interviews in the context of the Marie Curie-project, which is with an ethical framework. Of course, also the podcast is ethical, but I don't put it in the face of my interviewees, and usually that changes a lot when I do that. So when I connect to an artist and I say I want to interview for the research, then the fact that it's from the European Commission also changes a little bit the way they answer. I have experienced, and I also wonder, because I give them the opportunity to be anonymized completely, and when I process the transcripts, it's completely anonymized. So if someone hacks in my computer, nobody should be able to find who was the interlocutor. But usually the artists are not concerned with that, because they are really also trying to promote a little bit themselves and their art through this, which is fine. I really want also to give a platform for them, but it's a bit counterproductive sometimes. So it creates all these other, again, restrictions and frames during the interview process, which I don't necessarily feel immediately in the podcast. So yeah, thanks for that question, Aslı. That's wonderful.
Well, maybe we can have one more question by Işıl Erikavuk. very quickly, please.
Yes, I will do it quickly. I'll try. Yeah, and as the person on the other side, I was one of these performance artists that spoke there. And I was wondering. I mean, also I'm doing dialogue. I am interested in. I'm practicing dialogue-based art, and when you are making a work that is based on dialogue, whatever format it takes in the end. I think there are also these other questions that come focus around empathy and hierarchy. And I think the same can also be in academia, even if you are presenting this as a podcast. Yeah, I mean, how do you see I want to ask you, Peter, how do you see your role in the hierarchy of roles here between yourself and the podcasters? And as a final note, I have to say I really liked how you want to hear from you.
Yeah, I think the last bit where the gratitude was expressed was not coming through, but I understand. Yeah, what can I say here? I mean, I have to be very careful. I mean, I'm constantly thinking about my own position, let's say, and I know that I'm a white, privileged male researcher who speaks Turkish, but not to the same extent, of course, as others who could do this work maybe even better. But I lived through the whole events in Turkey, and I have to, of course, thank Görkem Akos, my partner, for that as well. I'm not cursing her for that, but I think I have a situated knowledge or a place from where I can talk. So one idea is actually to have one podcast episode where Görkem will interview me, so that also people understand my position and positionality in that. Yeah, and I like what you say. It's really meant to be a dialogue. So I also take my own personality within that, and I reflect on it constantly. And I think that's the role that we should be doing. If it's funded by European Commission or not, that doesn't matter to me. It's more about yeah, how we as researchers take this ethical role seriously. And I do hope that it conveys, especially through the podcast now, because I think it's a wonderful medium to disseminate knowledge, and especially under COVID times, I started to listen to many podcasts, and I feel that you can convey that sense of connectedness through the sound and to the connection with the voice better than with text or with an image. Thank you.
Thank you very much.